Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you to the Sauce Labs team for putting up this conference and having me over. Let's start with a couple of questions. What's a good speedy build, CI/CD build for you in your view? And on the other hand, what's a slow CI/CD build for you? Is it 10 minutes? Is it 1 hour? Is it a few hours? And obviously, what was the worst CI/CD build experience time-wise or to debug that you ever had to cope with or had to resolve? In my case, the story went like this. Story of a whole day build. That gives you an idea. Essentially, I wake up one morning and first thing I do is check my email. And here it is on top of my emails is my friendly CI tool telling me that my build from the previous day has failed. Okay, no big deal. We've seen that before, right? Make some coffee, make some breakfast, open up the laptop before going to work and make some changes, push some code, kick off the build, go to work, forget about it. That was circa 2015. I was working on a mobile team and for a retailer. We were working on a shopping app and we were really following the best engineering practices that we knew at the time. That meant clean architecture throughout. That meant following solid principles. That meant doing everything test first as well. And that wasn't only unit tests, but also functional tests. So every single feature had a set of functional tests, essentially tests that run on a device. Again, this was early 2015. Sauce Labs did not release a mobile testing product until September of that year. So it was Wild West of mobile, essentially. But yeah, every single feature had to be decided on and agreed upon by the product manager and the development team. We had to write a bunch of functional tests to basically verify whether this feature will work when it's developed. Without that, we wouldn't start. So 100% test coverage, that's great, right? Anyway, we were doing that. And in any case, I'm at work and I'm about to close off for the day. And when I get an email, guess who it is? It's my friendly neighborhood CI again and telling me that the build has failed. And yes, it's that same build that kicked off in the morning. It's still fine, right? 2 in a row. I mean, we've seen better, but we've also seen worse. So this happens. Must have missed something. And so I open up the laptop again, make some changes, and kick off another build. That will fix it, right? Well, no. The next day, the story repeats. And the day after, and the day after, and for I don't know how many days after as well. Before you know it, we are staring at this long queue of features, bug fixes, things that we wanted to release but couldn't because our CI is broken and so slow to give us feedback that we just can't do anything apart from keep adding code without knowing whether it works. And that's obviously not a good look because our product manager is angry. Their stakeholders are angry because the app is not getting shipped, and the score on the Google Play Store is going down because the bugs aren't getting fixed. That's not good, right? While on the other hand, the development team is basically staring at this red light of a build from our CI and nothing ever works. It's agonizing. And obviously we're starting to think, okay, let's just do this manually, right? Let's just do this manually and turn off the CI, do the build manually, do the test manually. Well, how hard can it be, right? You know how hard it can be. This is basically the analogy of ships waiting for Ever Given to be released and deciding to not go through Suez and go around the continent of Africa instead. That's the equivalent of turning off CI and doing it manually, essentially. It's a very, very slow, it's a very, very dangerous process, and you don't really want to do it when you think about it. Anyway, I would argue that even that red build, red light that we were looking at is a valuable signal. And in our case, it was telling us that our app was broken and in an unshippable state, and we should put in as much resources as we had to fix it. Because, yeah, an unshippable app is not an app I want to be proud of. I can be proud of. Anyway, this is a story of how we kind of improve this, and hopefully how you can avoid these kind of situations in the future. My name is Zan. I'm a developer advocate at CircleCI, and I've broken more builds than I would like to admit. Anyway, how do you make builds faster? Or how do you make builds take less than a day? As I mentioned, I work for a company called CircleCI, and we're a CI/CD platform, the largest shared CI/CD platform in the world. And while this talk is technology agnostic, I'm talking about principles that can be applied to any CI/CD tool or any CI/CD setup. I'm going to be using some concrete examples that kind of show things, how they're done in CircleCI. So in a nutshell, there are two aspects to CircleCI. First one is this config.yaml file where everything is configured. So that's a file that's committed alongside your repository, your app's repository. And in there, you define things like jobs, workflows, and orbs, among other things. Now, if you think about jobs, they are essentially a set of commands, a set of steps that are executed in a given environment. That can be a Docker image or a virtual machine running Linux, Windows, Mac OS. We even have ARM virtual machines available now. And the steps, they're essentially commands, command line instructions, combinations of those, or essentially reusable things you can get from these things called orbs, essentially reusable bits of that same config that you can use across different projects. You can share between your applications and your setups. And workflows is how you essentially arrange these jobs. So build, test, deploy, however many jobs, whatever jobs you have, you arrange them, you tell them when to run what, in what order, under what conditions, and so on. So that's kind of how this is configured. And the other part of CircleCI is the dashboard. The dashboard gives you a view of everything that's happening in all the builds that are happening in your organization, all the projects, all the workflows that you've been running, all the pipelines. You can see, okay, you can drill into one and see, okay, each step, how it's run. You can kind of dig into tests and so on. So yeah, configuration and the dashboard that kind of runs everything. And each build is configured by committing and pushing this to your repository that's configured to CircleCI. Anyway, back to the talk. Now you may think, how do I know that I have a problem with slow builds? I mentioned one example already. It's when you're considering switching off CI because it's just so slow that you can't ship anything. That's a very acute sign that something is wrong. Other extreme might be that your builds are just becoming slower and slower and slower, but that, on the other hand, happens very gradually. You're not going to see a dramatic increase from today to tomorrow. Instead, you'll see it from this week to 2 months from now, essentially, if you can't keep track of that. In between those two extremes, you have also times that your builds are kind of staying red. Essentially, the times it takes you to fix build that is broken, or my personal favorite is when your team tells you in retrospectives, in one-on-ones, that they're struggling with CI, because they will tell you, because they will express that this is a problem that they're suffering with, and they are just kind of not productive because of it. And when they start saying that CI is the bottleneck, then you know that something is a very acute problem. So what do we do to avoid this problem in the future? We need to identify what's wrong, where it's wrong, and we do that by measuring different things. First off, you can measure the whole build length and each different components. For example, this is how long it takes me to build an application, and this is how long it takes me to run the tests. That's a very kind of broad stroke measurements that are still kind of giving you some insights. Throw them into any dashboard, into any spreadsheet, and over time you'll see how this has moved on. Luckily, most CI tools out there give you a lot better tools than that. In fact, you have pretty good tools available if you're just using a modern CI that gives you, okay, like for example, each individual job, each individual build, how it's behaving, each test type, how it's behaving, how long it's taking, how accurate it is. All you can even drill down to individual test level, and that's something, for example, that CircleCI does with the Insights tab. For example, you can see exactly how long a workflow is running, how long has it run compared to 90 days ago, how which of my jobs is the slowest. For example, this build Docker is a lot slower than my build and test jobs, for example, and what's the success rate, and even drill down into individual tests. That's pretty cool. Now that you kind of have an idea of where your issues or bottlenecks lie, you can start thinking about how to solve this to make it go faster. So I am going to present a couple of, or a few examples of how to do that. First one is add more power. And I don't mean horsepower, I mean execution power. So more RAM, more CPU, use bigger computers for your builds. A good example for that might be you're suffering a lot of OOM errors, so out of memory errors. Add more memory. Any Java developer will know what I'm talking about. The other example might be if you know that your build requires a lot of can use a lot of cores, a lot of concurrent threads being run, then yes, more CPU cores might help make this faster. A very good benchmark or like a rule of thumb test that I find is also if something runs faster on your local developer machine. So example, 16 gigs of RAM, i7, like a reasonably modern developer machine, a year or two old. If your build runs faster there, substantially faster than it does on your CI, it might be because you're running your CI build on a 1 CPU, 2 gigs of RAM kind of situation. And increase that power, you'll go faster. Okay, so that's the easiest thing to do. In CircleCI, you basically just specify this resource class and you're off to the races, and you can go up to like 128 gigs of RAM at the time of this talk being recorded. Anyway, you can also go parallel. What I mean by that is essentially splitting up work and running it concurrently at the same time. You can run individual jobs in parallel, and in Circle, actually, this runs by default. So if you're kind of specifying your jobs in a workflow, as I showed you earlier, they by default run in parallel. So you can run unit tests, instrumentation test, smoke tests, any type of tests, even security scans in parallel before then kicking off some kind of deployment, for example. And in case of tests being slow, and that was a case of our app that I mentioned. In case of apps test being slow, as it was the case of my app I mentioned earlier, you could even split those tests within an individual test suite. And we have some tools for that in Circle CI. Essentially, you have this command line interface, CLI, that lets you kind of identify and automatically split the tests by how long they take to run. So they kind of, you basically tell it you want parallelism of, let's say, 4, 5, 6, 10, however many concurrent processes, and it will figure out by time approximately similarly kind of sized buckets of tests that execute about the same time. So you're really getting the most out of your speed up value. There is other ways to do it, but essentially time is by far my favorite one. Beyond parallelism and bigger machines, you can consider looking into caching. So caching is essentially just deduplicating parts of your work. So once you're done something, you don't have to do it again because you can utilize that cache that you've kind of created earlier. And I put caching into two categories. One is what you need, and the second one is what you built. What you need is essentially your dependencies, what you need before you can even start making your build, executing your build. And that's like git cache. And that usually comes out of the box with most CI/CD tools. So you don't really do a whole history clone. You just get the small delta that you need from your commit, and the rest is already kind of ready for you. The other one is dependencies. Like, you may use Node.js, you may use Python or Ruby or whatever. Some dependencies take a long time to install, and some dependencies bring their own dependencies. So if you don't have to rely on the network and some kind of central repository to download those, you can cache those. If they don't change, you can just reuse the same cache and you should be good. And I mentioned some Circle CI orbs. For example, Node.js orb actually comes with this install packages command that will automatically bring them from cache and save them from cache. So each time, each subsequent build will be faster because of that. Lastly, you can consider, if you're using Docker for your builds, you can consider storing if you use Docker for your builds and you're installing a bunch of stuff onto each container that you're running, for example, if you need some extra dependencies, and that takes a lot of time each time, then you might just create your own Docker image that you want to use for your needs that already has all those dependencies, that then you can reuse just that image without kind of installing that manually each time. And the other part of caching is what you built. And by that, I mean things like build steps. For example, if you have unit tests, integration tests, functional tests that all rely on similar kind of artifacts, you can cache those like intermediary artifacts or kind of complete build artifacts and pass those between jobs. And that's obviously going to save you a bunch of time in the process. And if you're building Docker images as part of your builds, you can actually turn on Docker layer caching, which essentially caches everything, every instruction in your Docker file up to whatever has changed. So all your copies, all your runs, if your kind of Docker file contents haven't changed, you will automatically be reusing everything up until the point where it's actually changed. So it's very convenient and very easy way to benefit from it. Next up is less technical, but more operational, and it's going smaller. Essentially, doing less will take less time. That's pretty obvious. And yes, sometimes it's valuable to cut scope of tests. In our case, if you've done this type of test first development, where you write functional tests before each feature gets developed, you might notice, or you might think, okay, that might be testing too many things that are off the critical path, and that's exactly what we were doing. We were testing things that really weren't important to the overall shopping journey of our kind of retail shopping app. And you really need to kind of start considering, okay, is this critical, or is this something that we can manually test, or maybe not test in this case, or rely on unit tests to get it done. So yeah, you cut the scope. Obviously, that can cut a lot of craft from your builds, time-wise, and also from flakiness perspective. Or you can even run a subset of your build. For example, maybe I want to run only unit tests on each commit, but I want to still run the whole functional test suite whenever I'm kind of preparing for release. So whenever I'm creating a new tag, I'm pushing a new tag, I want to run the whole thing. And you can do that via this workflow configuration that I mentioned. Finally, I suppose the most valuable thing you could do is essentially get your team on board. So if you're the only person who is responsible or kind of knowledgeable about the CI/CD tool, obviously you're the only point of failure. If you're not there when something is broken, your team can't deploy. So it's on the other hand, it's very easy to get your team involved, because, as I mentioned, everything is configured as code in most CI CD setups. So just tell them, okay, this is where the whole script lies, and this is what it does. So study this, ask me any questions, contribute, and ask the team to kind of really own this kind of CI/CD setup collectively, which will make it a lot easier to onboard any new members, and also a lot easier for people to suggest improvements or fix them themselves if they think that they're struggling with a particular portion of it. So yeah, teamwork does make the dream work, always. In any case, I asked this question in the beginning. What is the right build time for your team? What's fast for you? What's fast enough for you? And it's really a question for you. It's not a question I can answer. There is no definitive answer to give, because each team is different, each product is different, each platform is different. So but having said that, we did release the State of Software Delivery report back in late last year, which basically looked at a bunch of data points from a lot of builds that happen on our platform. I think there were about 55 million data points. And there is some very interesting stats in there. You can find it at this link. I'm also going to be dropping this link in the chat along with other resources. So yeah, check it out. It's ungated, so you just kind of download it, and it's pretty good reading. Finally, CI/CD is not about speed, not only about speed. It's not a race. You're not gonna win everything or anything by making something go 4 minutes instead of 5 minutes, or making something go 1 minute instead of 3 minutes. You're really looking at something completely different. And to that note, I like to consider CI/CD more like an ambulance instead of a race car, because it should go fast, but it also has a very important payload to carry. It has to carry that signal that I mentioned from the beginning reliably to the end. So you need to be able to trust that whatever is tested, whatever is deployed, is actually doing so, is actually the app that you want it to be. So yeah, if you see it, If you see it red, it go red. If you see the lights flashing, you should also go fix it ASAP and give it priority over your other development work. So that was the need for speed, and I hope you learned some insights. I hope you learned some tricks. My name is Zan Markan. It's been a pleasure. I'm here to answer your questions in the chat. Thank you.